the CAR tool is designed primarily, as said, to support adaptation planners and practitioners, right? In that transition and kind of crossing the threshold from NDC and NAP planning to NDC implementation, and in doing so in a way that accelerates transformative change in the agriculture and land use sectors, right? To achieve that, this tool is presented as a practical step-by-step approach that users can adopt to plan and identify which of the actions in their national climate plans, so NDCs and NAPs, have the highest transformative potential for the sector, and then guide them in the preparation of actionable roadmaps for the implementation of those prioritized climate actions, right? So this means that the tool is especially useful for NDC and NAP project development and programming, but also for finance mobilization, right? Because it helps to unlock those critical levers of systems change and address key risks to investment, right? And lastly, I just wanted to mention that the tool is flexible in nature, so it can be easily adapted to different country contexts and users' strategic priorities, right? So in short, the tool has a few important core functions and features. As I mentioned, it supports the transitioning from NDC and NAP planning to implementation. It allows us to assess the potential of planned adaptation efforts and entry points for transformative change. It can also serve as a guide for designing multidimensional strategic interventions for delivering on NDC and NAP priorities through adaptation projects. It can also be used in its monitoring and evaluation function, so to be able to iteratively track the contribution of ongoing adaptation efforts to transformative climate action. It's inclusive in the sense that it facilitates communication with and between policymakers, financiers, other stakeholders, key for unlocking finance. And lastly, it fosters multi-stakeholder engagement, right, and collaboration due to its kind of participatory modalities. And ultimately, by using this tool, it's the hope that country planners would have strengthened capacity to steer future adaptation projects, programs, and interventions towards climate-resilient agri-food system transformation, right? So the tool is organized, like I said, around steps. So there's 5 steps in the process that are outlined here. What's important to note is the first 3 steps can be completed in an online interface of the tool, or alternatively in an offline Excel sheet. Whereas step 4 and 5 require a multi-stakeholder workshop or kind of key informant interviews, right? But it's really the participatory segment of the tool. So step 1 is the prep phase, which I'll walk us through. Step 2 consists of the shortlisting of adaptation priorities from NDCs, NAPs, and other climate plans relevant to agriculture, which will then be assessed for their transformative potential in step 4. Step 3 is the stakeholder mapping, where we are ensuring that the key stakeholders required are consulted in the planning phase. And step 4 is the actual assessment of the transformative potential of the shortlisted adaptation priorities, right? And finally, step 5 is the moment in which we start to develop actionable roadmaps for the implementation of the transformative climate actions identified and prioritized, right? So let's look at step 1, which is then the next slide. So step 1, as mentioned, involves preparing for the consultative assessment. So this includes establishing the coordination team, defining the purpose of the assessment, selecting its modality, and collecting all of the relevant policy documents, which serve as the starting point, right? NDCs, NAPs, LTS, or other national or sectoral climate plans, which contain the adaptation options that will be reviewed. So after completing step 1, the output would be a long list of, maybe 20 to 30 adaptation options generated and sourced from these national or sectoral climate plans. under step one, this is where, we're forming the coordination team, which should consist of, lead government ministries, department, or agencies that are tasked with coordinating the assessment. And then other representatives from government or civil society or other institutions that are involved in climate change and agricultural planning and programming in the country. So this includes like NDC focal points or NAP focal points or more planners, right? And in the handbook, you'll find more details on how to form this coordination team and what exactly the specific tasks of each of those individuals would be. This is also where we select the modality of the assessment, right? So we said it can be either more of an in-depth approach or a rapid assessment. So an in-depth approach would be kind of a 2-day participatory multi-stakeholder consultation to exchange on knowledge and information that's valuable for assessing each adaptation option against transformative change potential. And it's the moment in which we're looking at the climate action capacities, needs, and outcomes that will allow us to assess the transformative potential, right? Now, the second option is the rapid assessment. So that's where, you might not have the capacities to organize a multi-stakeholder engagement workshop, but you could conduct a desk review alongside key informant interviews, right? So this is just a snapshot of the tools interface in step one, which is where we're collecting the relevant policy documents. So the assessment lead would be responsible for that. What are the key policy documents? And this really represents the starting point of the assessment, right? Because it contains the national adaptation priorities in the agriculture and land use sectors. So after having collected the relevant documents, then you would be asked to identify the key adaptation options within those documents, right? And here is where we start to create our long list of adaptation options. And we're also qualifying each of them, right? So we're qualifying what is the adaptation objective stated in the policy document? What is the relevant sector or subsector or value chain or ecosystem to which this adaptation option pertains. And then lastly, what is the scale of intervention, right? Is it a particular geographical area or agroecological zone, or maybe an administrative zone where the adaptation option is expected to be implemented? And the handbook provides some useful guidance on how best to extract information on those different adaptation options within your policy documents. All right, so after we've completed the kind of long listing of adaptation options, which was the conclusion of step one, step two is focused on screening each of those adaptation priorities to see the extent to which they're aligned with the user's strategic mandate and area of programmatic interest, right? So this might be a government ministry or a civil society organization or an international organization with a mandate in supporting climate action in the agricultural land use sectors, right? Now this step is where we also will review the current status of implementation of each of the adaptation options in the NDCs and NAPs, which will serve useful for us because it says where are there gaps in implementation or where are there opportunities to scale up successes, right? So it helps us to prioritize later what are the entry points for our programming. So the ultimate output of this step would be the long list of adaptation options narrowed down to around 5 to 10 adaptation priorities that then we can evaluate for their transformative climate action potential in the following steps, right? So looking deeper into step two, here you can see, on the left side, in the left column, you have the adaptation options that were identified or extracted from the NDC and NAP, followed by the respective objective, the sector, and the scale. And our objective here is to screen each of these against 3 criteria. So one is, what is the alignment with the user's strategic mandate? The second is what is the alignment with the users, sector or subsector or ecosystem of interest. So you can imagine that some ministries are focused more on agriculture, others, if mangroves might be a mandate of the forestry ministry, for instance, and of course, civil society and international organizations also have their strategic mandates and comparative advantages, right? And criteria 3 is more the alignment of the particular geography or agroecological zone of interest, right? So some of us work in certain regions or at certain scales. And so it's a simple scoring, 0 to 5, what is the alignment? And then the tool will automatically help us to start to short list. So this is the point where we look at the status of implementation of each of the adaptation options, and within, the coordinator of the assessment, which has that background on the status of implementation, would start to assign the status. So is there steady progress, so no supports required? Is there partial progress, so there's an opportunity maybe for scaling up? Or is there no progress and support is required? And so the simple output of this step is our short list of 5 to 10 priorities, which are automatically generated by the online tool, which will serve as the basis for our consultative assessment in the following step 4 later. So step 3 is the step that we'll be completing. It's the last step in the online interface of the tool before we move to either the stakeholder workshop or the desk review with interviews, depending on the assessment modality you've chosen. And this step does involve the mapping of the stakeholder groups. And the idea is that for each adaptation option, we're identifying the relevant stakeholders for those adaptation options. So if the example around energy and the installment of energy infrastructure on agricultural land, because the sectors involved there require energy and agriculture and land use actors, both would be identified in the stakeholder list, right? So this is why it's important to map those stakeholders particular to each adaptation option, right? And the idea here is that the more diverse the stakeholder group, the more accurate will be the representation of a country's adaptation priorities, capacities, needs, and challenges, right? So at the end of this step, we'd have, in the online interface, we would have inserted the relevant stakeholders, their name, their institution, all of that information with their contact details, so that the output of the online tool would be this kind of packaged information that will help us prepare for the workshop, which contains who are the, NVTs, what are the options that we'll be exploring, who are the coordination leads of this assessment, their roles, a kind of package that leads us to the next step. So next slide is just an overview of the main stakeholder groups that the handbook provides guidance on that you may wish to consult. The handbook does go into detail about some examples of each of these main stakeholder groups. So governments, civil society, intergovernmental organizations and partners, range of private sector actors, and specialized research or universities and institutions. And I think one point to mention here is while we're mapping the various stakeholders to be consulted, it's important that we consider not only the stakeholder groups that are directly impacted by or vulnerable to the adverse impacts of climate change, so our direct beneficiaries, but also those actors or institutions that have an influence on the conditions underpinning that their vulnerability and their capacity to adapt and respond to climate change, right? So all of the actors that influence the social, the economic, the political conditions or enabling environment within the country, right? So step 4 is where, we've mapped the relevant stakeholders and we're in the context of a multi-stakeholder consultation workshop. Now, the handbook does provide guidance on how to organize a workshop. In the annex, you can find kind of an illustrative agenda. And remember, the output of that online interface was a kind of package of information that prepares you for the workshop, right? Or a desk review with interviews. So in this step, we'll be assessing the transformative potential of the shortlisted adaptation options generated. And at the end of this step, we'll have each adaptation priority reviewed either quantitatively or qualitatively against the different dimensions of transformative potential. Next slide. So Julie presented in the very beginning the main 6 elements of transformation against which each adaptation option is assessed. These include the climate rationale, private sector engagement, gender equality, whole of government approaches, technological innovation, and sustainable development outcomes, right? Each adaptation option would be reviewed and quantitatively scored for each of these elements in response to questions and guiding questions under each of these 6 elements, right? That would allow for conversation and then quantitative scoring, and combined with, since you'd be in the context of a stakeholder engagement workshop, qualitative justification for each of those scores, right? And then the tool automatically computes, once you input the values into the tool, a consolidated score across all 6 elements, and a results dashboard is generated. So next slide shows. So I'll preface this by saying I won't get into each adaptation or each indicator against which we're reviewing the adaptation option. This is an overview, but just to say that each adaptation option that we prioritize would be evaluated against the 6 elements and the 20 criteria here of transformative climate action potential. So for instance, we'd be looking at, for an adaptation option, what is its adaptation relevance? So what dimensions of adaptation results would the option be addressing? Is it vulnerability? Is it adaptive capacity? Is it longer term resilience? Are non-climatic drivers of vulnerability being addressed, right? So this is things around maybe existing exposure to other risks, poverty levels, food insecurity levels. Those sorts of elements would be considered here. And lastly, the opportunity to contribute to mitigation, so generate mitigation co-benefits, right? And questions you'll find within the handbook for each of these elements and indicators. You'll find a questionnaire in the annex that can be distributed to small working groups in a workshop where each adaptation option would be analyzed against the 6 elements and indicators, right? Now, the handbook also provides some guidance on potential data sources to draw upon for the evaluation that could be presented in the workshop or discussed, right? So for instance, with the climate rationale, we might draw upon existing climate risk and vulnerability assessments. Under the private sector component, we might look at existing cost-benefit analysis or kind of business case models. Under gender equality, existing gender studies focused on marginalized groups in agri-food systems. Under whole of government, we'll probably take into account different sectoral or national strategies. So, the topic of energy versus land use came up. We would be looking into those elements under this component. Under innovation, technological innovation, maybe drawing upon TNAs, so technology needs assessments, or I don't know, compendiums of indigenous people's knowledge that is relevant for adaptation. And lastly, sustainable development, right? So here we would be looking at existing statistics, maybe poverty maps or food insecurity and nutrition levels. That sort of data would be important under that component, right? So this is just an illustrative snapshot of some of the results from the analysis. They're automatically calculated and they can be displayed at the workshop and interpreted as a group in a workshop setting. Now the handbook provides some guidance to the workshop moderator to walk a group through the interpretation of these results. And just to say that, these results provide kind of a snapshot of, based on inputs of a wide range of stakeholders, of which adaptation options hold the greatest potential for transformative change across all of the 6 elements of transformation. And it can, assist adaptation planners in undergoing this important prioritization process, right? Which is key for understanding what are the adaptation priorities to be taken forward for implementation as part of their programming and project pipeline development. And this is often so necessary against a backdrop of limited resources and competing investments, right? And at the same time, not only is this kind of quantitative scoring happening, but you're also collecting qualitative information that can serve as recommendations and as kind of guiding principles and recommendations for adaptation programming and investment pipeline going forward. Again, another snapshot of the detail from the dashboard. So for each adaptation option reviewed, you have these kind of diagrams that are automatically generated for how they score up against the 6 dimensions. And I think it's, can also help when reflecting on, how have I designed my adaptation intervention? How can I maybe improve in certain areas of going forward in implementation to ensure that I'm developing a package of intervention that can touch upon all of the different levers of transformation, right? Step 5 is really the moment in which we start to develop the actionable roadmap for implementing the adaptation options that were prioritized, right? This can be, again, in the workshop setting. So a facilitator may guide using the template provided in the handbook around questions like, what are the next steps for programming? Who's responsible? What are the main milestones? A mapping of which finance opportunities exist, which partners could be engaged. Can the program build on any existing projects or scale up any existing activities? And so in a way, the roadmap could be, is the ultimate output of the tool. It can serve as important communication instrument for sharing evidence on where opportunities lie for unlocking transformative change and guiding investments going forward. And I think my very last slide is just a snapshot of some examples coming out of the Scala program where we had mentioned this tool has been applied and is guiding adaptation programming at different scales in Uganda and Costa Rica and in Thailand. And I think that's where I end, and back over to you, Sybil.